Survivor, a game about winners and a game about losers. Millions of people around the world dream of playing. Over 600 people have played this game and the majority of them have failed. This video is not about those people. Winners. This video is all about Survivor winners, specifically deciding who is the best of the best in terms of Survivor winners. And the cool, wicked, sick, hype part about this idea is, I didn't come up with the rankings, you did. I love getting the community involved and you all killed it with some polls getting over 4,000 votes. At this point, you're probably asking yourself, what does a Survivor winner tournament even mean? Think of this Survivor tournament as like the MLB or NBA playoffs. You got a bunch of teams on one side of the bracket and a bunch of other teams on the other side. And you always have the best seeded team playing against the worst seeded team. You can probably already tell there's one really big issue with this. In most people's Survivor winner rankings, you have people like Tony, Boston Rob, Sandra, Kim in that top group. Spoiler alert, that doesn't happen here. And that's because everything is all random in the bracket. Fun fact, we're about to get to it, but Kim got kicked out in the very first round of the tournament. A little bit of ground rules before we get started. 6 rounds total, single knockout elimination. 22 winners get a bye to the second round. Now, I would never call any of you watching this dumb for the decisions you made, but I'm not gonna lie, you made a lot of really dumb decisions. Or at least decisions that are really controversial and that I wouldn't have made. This video is sponsored by my Discord. The entire tournament idea originally came from the Discord community. You should go check it out, link in the description. Going into round 1, I saw 2 really interesting matchups that I had no idea how the community was gonna react to. We had Parvati Shallow versus Kim Spradlin. Again, I don't like being mean to any of you, but some of you are really stupid with how you voted in that poll. And we also had Tom Westman versus Sarah Lucina. And I knew for sure that one was gonna be crazy as the final vote came to 48% to 52% for the winner. And this is what ended up happening. Let's roll the results. Boston Rob Mariano versus Michelle Fitzgerald. Mike Holloway versus Earl Cole. Brian Heidig versus Chris Underwood. Richard Hatch versus Fabio. Adam Klein versus Tommy Sheehan. Tom Westman versus Sarah Lucina. Ben Driebergen versus JT. Parvati Shallow versus Kim Spradlin. Erica Kashapuan versus Chris Doherty. Wendell Holland versus Ethan Zahn. Going into round 2, I knew we were going to have more controversial matchups, with Todd Herzog versus Boston Rob, John Cochran and Earl Cole, 2 fan favorite winners. Again, some of you made some really questionable decisions, but it made for a really interesting poll. We had one poll at such a high spread at 94% versus 6%. That was of course Arish Bukowskis versus Parvati Shallow, and we also had a super close matchup at 53% to 47% with Boston Rob and Todd Herzog. Let's roll the results. Tony Nachos Cagayan versus Vesepia Tauri. Tony Nachos Winners at War versus Denise Stapley. Amber Mariano versus Tyson Apostle. Sandra Diaz-Twine Heroes versus Villains versus Marianne Oakage. Natalie White versus Jeremy Collins. Sophie Clark versus Yul Kwan. Todd Herzog versus Boston Rob Mariano. John Cochran versus Earl Cole. Tina Wesson versus Brian Heidig. Nick Wilson versus Richard Hatch. Natalie Anderson versus Adam Klein. Bob Crowley versus Sarah Lucina. Jenna Maraska versus JT. Arish Bukowskis versus Parvati Shallow. Sandra Diaz-Twine Pearl Islands versus Chris Doherty. Danny Boatwright versus Ethan Zahn. I would say round 3 was when things really started to get interesting, as you saw one side of the bracket was way more competitive than the other side. It was weird to see, and we all knew it was coming. Both of Tony's wins were on the same side of the bracket, so eventually they were going to meet up. Again, we had a crazy close poll at 52% to 48% with Sandra's Heroes versus Villains win and Sarah Lucina's win. You gotta remember, all the seeding, it was all random how everything was aligned together, but somehow we had both Blood vs. Water wins, Natalie Anderson and Tyson Apostle in the same poll together. And if you remember during our last poll, even though it was all random, both Blood vs. Water seasons were battling it out there as well. Anyway, let's roll the results. Todd Herzog versus Tony Nachos Cagayan. Earl Cole versus Tina Wesson. Richard Hatch versus Tony Nachos Winners at War. Natalie Anderson versus Tyson Apostle. Sarah Lucina versus Sandra Diaz-Twine Heroes versus Villains. JT versus Parvati Shallow. Sandra Diaz-Twine Pearl Islands versus Jeremy Collins. Ethan Zahn versus Yul Kwan. We're now entering the quarterfinals. This is round 4, and this is where it became super apparent that the random draft order made one side of the bracket way more competitive than the other side. On one side of the bracket, you had Tony versus Earl and Tony versus Natalie Anderson. And on the other side of the bracket, you had Sarah versus Parvati and Jeremy versus Yul. Now again, I don't want to point fingers at anyone, but not gonna lie, I think some of you fumbled the ball here as you kept allowing Parvati to sneak through the polls. Our closest matchup this round was 45% to 55% with Jeremy Collins and Yul Kwon battling it out. Let's go roll the results of round 4. Tony Nachos Cagayan versus Earl Cole. Tony Nachos Winners at War versus Natalie Anderson. Sarah Lucina versus Parvati Shallow. Jeremy Collins versus Yul Kwon. Entering the semifinals, one of the matchups was super interesting as so many comments were saying that should have been the final matchup. And that was, of course, Tony versus Tony. Tony's win in Cagayan, although very flawed as a win, it's a fan favorite win for sure. And then you have Tony's win in Winners at War, I would argue the best dominating Survivor win of all time. And on the other side of things, we had Parvati versus Yul. These are two awesome fan favorite winners of Survivor, but again, weird to have them here. Possibly Yul deserves a spot here in the semifinals, but I'm also not too sure about Parvati. When they both played Survivor for the first time, Yul literally beat Parvati in the game. I think I'm still super petty and bitter that all of you let Parvati beat Kim all the way in the first round. Let's go roll the results of what happened. Tony Nachos Cagayan versus Tony Nachos Winners at War. Parvati Shallow versus Yul Kwon. Obviously, the final round here, we have Tony's Winners at War win versus Parvati's Fan versus Favorites win. Although this wasn't the matchup I was personally expecting to see in the finals, it's cool to see two Survivor legends battling it out here in the finals. A lot of comments on these polls pointed it out, but I think the polling was a little bit biased as people were voting based on Survivor legacy and how much they liked the player versus how they won that specific season. And with it coming down to 70% versus 30%, Tony Nachos Winners at War versus Parvati Shallow. Here's an overview of the entire tournament if you're curious. Anyways, make sure to subscribe for more Survivor content and click right here for the Survivor Season Rankings tournament. Peace!